What is critical race theory, and why are so many Christians so alarmed by it? CRT has become central to conversations about race over the last few years, conversations that have become heated and divisive. But what if we found a way to talk about CRT that brought people together instead of driving them apart? To that end, we're hosting a two-part series featuring two experts who will help us understand CRT's origins, its recent entry into mainstream culture, and how it complements or contradicts the Christian worldview. First, I'm joined by author and scientist Neil Shenvi, who's become a leading critic of critical theory in our culture. Neil Shenvi, welcome to the Maybe God podcast. Thank you for making the time, brother.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, Eric.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about yourself and your background. We're going to get into the big ideas that you're wrestling with publicly through your writings and things. And ideas matter, but we like stories even more than ideas. So tell us a little bit about your story.
So I grew up in a really loving, wonderful, but non-Christian home in Delaware. Went to college in New Jersey, grad school in California. Met my future wife. We got married when we were pretty young, 22, and now have 4 kids. She went on to get a PhD and an MD, and then an MBA, and I just only got a PhD. So I worked around the Ivies, Yale, and then later Duke. But about 10 years ago, I quit my job at Duke to homeschool our 4 kids. So I do that now, and I'm an author. If you Google me, Google says I'm an author, not a homeschooling dad. So
it sounds like
that's my official title.
Yeah, you're that and a lot more. What's it like having earned a PhD and yet have a wife who makes you feel inadequate with all of her degrees? How's that feel?
Right, that's the thing. Well, my kids, we joked about it. Our kids would say, "Daddy, why do you only have 1 doctorate? Mommy has 2 and an MBA." And I said, well, I'm an underachiever, I guess.
Yeah, so that's hilarious. You sped through a lot of your early life there. You said you grew up in Delaware. What was your upbringing like, more or less? I mean, how was it, traditional or not?
Yeah, traditional. I mean, I have great parents. My dad's a chemist. My mom's a foreign language teacher. And, but when I went to college, I would have called myself spiritual, but not religious. I kind of looked down on the fundamentalist Christians who, read their Bible and stuff like that. But I would have called myself Christian because, I believed in God and I was a good person. But then meeting my future wife, Christina, in college, when she was a genuine believer, and then realizing, what she calls a Christian is something different than what I was calling a Christian.
Yeah.
She means he actually believes this stuff. And I was intrigued because she was, smart, funny, beautiful, but also humble. And I pretended to be humble, but I was not humble. I was obsessed with being better than other people. So that really was attractive to me, that she really seemed to not care so much about her reputation, her excellence. She viewed it as a blessing from God. That was appealing to me, but also perplexing. Anyway, so we moved out to California for grad school, and that's where I began going to church with her. And that's how I heard the gospel and became a Christian.
Okay. California, huh? Well, that was at Berkeley, right?
Yeah, Berkeley. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Don't hear a lot of conversion stories out of Berkeley these days. What was it exactly that sort of got you over the line and all in with Jesus?
Right. The big thing, so I'd read a lot of C.S. Lewis. I read the Screwtape Letters probably 10 or 20 times as a non-Christian. It was fascinating to me because it had such insight into my condition. I couldn't figure out how Lewis knew that. How does he have such insight into my personal struggles? And of course, now I know the answer is he's a Christian. He's tuned into humanity's struggles. He knows the darkness in our hearts and our need and our posing and our rationalization. And it's a brilliant book. So that was one thing. And then knowing my wife and then going to church with her, the big question for me essentially was, will you humble yourself and admit that you don't really know God? You claim to be so intellectual and smart, you're better than these stupid Christians. But if you become a Christian, you'll have to admit that all that was a lie, that you didn't really have an inside track on theology. You have to enter the kingdom like a little child. And I remember the night that I became a Christian, I think, was when I said to God, I don't even know who you are anymore. But if Jesus is your son, I'll follow him. That's the mustard seed of faith. It's like,
right.
It's like the guy who says, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know, but I know this. I was blind, now I see. Like, wow, that's not Westminster Confession of Faith level of theological precision there, and yet it's enough. it's saying yes to Jesus and accepting his offer to rescue you.
Wow.
And of course, I did have a long way to go theologically, but I think that was the night when I crossed from death to life.
Interesting. Yeah, it wasn't some positive view of God or some bright light revelation necessarily. It was more about seeing yourself for who you really were and your need for him.
Well, and not in just it, the big obstacle, I think, to Christianity, between me and Christianity, was my pride. Is I thought I knew everything already. I'd made my own God that was better than the Christian God. But having to say, no, if Christianity is true, then I don't know God, and I need to learn and be taught. That was hard for me because I prided myself on my intellectualism and my sophistication. But yet God meets us. It's called the divine humility, that he would take this, this barest confession of faith and say that I can work with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had someone tell me recently, I don't remember who it was, or I would totally credit them with this, and I'm going to paraphrase because they said a different word than I'm going to say, but he said to me that his dad used to tell him the beginning of wisdom is realizing and remembering what a jerk you are, which is an interesting perspective, but I find that to be the case.
Yeah, Socrates said that knowledge is, isn't it Socrates that knowledge is the progressive discovery over ignorance. And in the spiritual realm, that definitely is true. That to truly, and same thing with morally too, the more we know God, the more we recognize our own failure and our need for grace. I think objectively do grow in goodness and kindness and love and the fruit of the Spirit, but subjectively we also are aware all the more of our own need for grace. So we're not saying you get actually worse. You do get better. God does work effectually on us. At the same time, I have friends said it's like walking into closer and closer to a street lamp when you're covered in dirt. You're not getting dirtier, but you're more and more aware of the dirt on you. So that's sanctification. We're becoming holier, and in a good sense, not in a self-righteous sense, but at the same time, we're more aware of our sin.
I love that analogy of the street lamp. I'm going to hold on to that. Now, you are an outspoken opponent of sort of the critical theory movement, and particularly you've written a lot about critical race theory. We're going to talk a lot about that in a minute. But I just want to make sure our listeners understand that this wasn't a fight that you went to school to learn how to fight. This isn't your field of study per se.
No, not at all.
What did you earn your PhD in, and what did you intend to do with your life?
So I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry. I worked, as a postdoc research scientist at Yale and then Duke, and I homeschooled my kids. So all of that up until like 2015. That's what I was doing. And my first book, I believe, is just a standard apologetics book about, did Jesus rise from the dead? Do we know God exists? How do we know that? It's very similar, like Reason for God, for example. But it was very much grew out of my conversion and wanting to share the gospel with my atheist, secular, agnostic, intellectual colleagues. Funny story that for whatever reason, theoretical chemistry seems to actually be disproportionately Christian, an evangelical Christian. So when I was moving into my office at Yale, I was going through the drawers. The last postdoc to leave had not quite cleaned out his office desk, and I pull open a drawer, and there's a stack of sermon CDs in the desk, and one of the deacons at our church was a grad student in the lab right next to me, and another guy was a Presbyterian. So there really was an openness in my field to spiritual things, and I think part of that is because the modern physics is so spooky. It's not this Victorian era balls and springs and billiard ball model, clockwork model of the universe. There are weird things within modern physics that makes you more open to unseen realities. But that way, I think C.S. Lewis actually talked about that in the Critique Letters, about how there have been some sad cases among the modern physicists who've become Christians because they realize I can't revert to this simplistic, naive model of the universe where all that spooky stuff is not real.
Right.
No. It's very much real. Not the angels and demon stuff maybe within the naturalistic worldview, but certainly strings and wave functions and entanglement. So you can't escape weirdness. You have to embrace weirdness of one kind or another. And so I think, again, it tends to humble people in terms of their knee-jerk materialism. Anyway.
Yeah.
But that's where I came from. So I was doing that stuff for, the first, let's see, 12, 15 years of my Christian life. But then, so around 2016 is I finished the first draft of Why Believe, and I was noticing a shift in our culture, probably many of us did, around the time of Black Lives Matter when it really took off. And I saw this language being deployed in the culture and within the church that didn't quite sit right with me. Something was wrong with how they were talking about race, class, gender, sexuality, and so forth. But I was not a culture warrior. I was not political. Even now, I'm not really into politics. But I was noticing these ideas that were bad, and I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. And around that time, I met my good friend and collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who was getting a PhD in education and cultural studies and basically studying critical pedagogy within this critical tradition. And when I heard what he was doing with his PhD, that's when the light bulb went off. And I thought, oh, this is where these ideas are coming from. It's from the critical tradition.
What were the sorts of things you were hearing in the culture that troubled you?
So let's take Black Lives Matter, for example. Just the idea that whites were privileged universally, not just privilege, meaning had unearned advantages, but they were somehow complicit in oppression. All whites and all people of color were oppressed. And to really understand how systemic oppression works, you have to have your lived experience guide your development of a critical consciousness. So you have to kind of get awoke. That was that colloquial term being used. Even today it's been used. Or even the idea that the gospel itself is about social justice, and not that the gospel implies that we ought to work for justice. I agree with that. That somehow the gospel is justice. The gospel is just a message about social justice, whatever that means. And also, it's a very nebulous definition of what social justice means. All of those, and I was not aware of what was going on. I heard this jargon being thrown around, and I just knew something wasn't quite right with it. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I think a lot of people are in the same boat where they just sense that we're not talking biblically about these issues anymore, but they can't figure out why. So that's where I was. And another example would be how I would see personally people that I knew, Christians, who began expressing a concern for social justice issues, which I thought just meant biblical justice. I'm like, yeah, it's great. Christians should work for justice. But then, lo and behold, within a few months, within a few years, their trajectory was getting more and more theologically progressive. They go from saying, I care about social justice, I'm like, well, that seems fine, to then saying, well, I don't even think Jesus was God. How come there's only one way to salvation? How do I know that the Bible's sexual ethics aren't obsolete and regressive? Like, wait a minute, how did you get from point A to point B? What's the connection? I couldn't tell, but I was seeing it. So that's what led me to investigate this further and try to figure out, is there some logical connection between caring about justice, which at the time I thought was very benign, and I still do if you define justice properly, but then drifting into this more and more theologically liberal approach to life. And there is a connection.
Right. And as you have said, you discovered that connection is something called critical theory. Could you give us some brief unpacking of what that is, or definition of what that is?
Sure. So the term critical theory was coined by a guy named Max Horkheimer in a 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory. He's a member of the Frankfurt School. These are a group of Marxist philosophers and sociologists working in Germany. And they were trying to apply Marx's ideas more broadly than just to economics. They were interested in how Marx wanted to understand how the classes, rich and the poor, the owning class, the working class, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, that how those classes were created by the means of production, who controlled the means of production, the factories, and how workers were being oppressed through economic means. That was Marx. Well, critical theorists of the Frankfurt School said, we want to apply Marx's insight more broadly and say, how does, say, mass media or the culture industry, how do those things create oppression? How do those things create a ruling class and an oppressed class? But even that, so that was a Frankfurt School in the 1930s. They moved to the States later at Columbia. That was still 80, 90 years ago. Today, critical theory is now an umbrella category that has spawned entire disciplines. So things like critical race theory, critical pedagogy, queer theory, post-colonial theory, fat studies. I know it sounds funny, but it's a real thing. All of those are critical social theories that fall under the umbrella today of critical theory. So it's not just one thing. It's this whole constellation of different social theories that all of them, what they have in common are several things, but they all aim to understand how society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along various axes of identity. So it's race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, and a host of other identity markers. So all critical theories have that in common.
Okay, this is interesting to me because I went to seminary in 2001 to 2005, and I attended a very progressive Methodist seminary in the Midwest that was founded in the civil rights era and sort of had that mark, that fingerprint on it in terms of its core identity. And people don't believe me now, but all the stuff that is called critical theory now and wokeness and all of that was part and parcel to my theological education in 20 plus years ago. And to the extent that we watched a film called The Color of Fear.
You give us a hard time for being white and being American and being in control.
For a white person to look at me and say, you're just like me, we're both American, totally insults me.
You're not allowed to be a black man in corporate America. Walk through some halls with some pride, you're gonna scare some people.
The whole message of it was, white man, bad, straight white man, straight white, able-bodied, Christian white man, worse. Bad. Tall, straight, white, able-bodied, all of these layers of privilege and power had implications in terms of how much you were supposed to talk and be represented in the seminary experience. And so we were made to sit, white guys like me were not made, we were encouraged, let's say, to sit on the floor or sit in places of...
To decenter yourself.
Yes. And, there were incentives to doing that, social and educational, I guess, incentives to go along with it, to not speak in class so that you're making, even if you had something great to say.
Making space.
Making space because, we had been so complicit in, the power structures of racism in the world that it was our turn to take a back seat and shut up about it. And, that was going on years and years ago. We didn't call it, I don't remember calling it critical race theory, although I do remember having a class on queer theory. I didn't have any classes on preaching, but I had a class on queer theory, which is interesting. And people wonder why the Methodist Church is falling apart. It's like, this has been sort of insidious in its encroaching upon the church and especially educating future leaders for many years now. It seems to have snuck up on people more broadly in the culture. Like folks didn't hear about it until COVID, I guess, or George Floyd.
Right. Well, it's been around, like you said, for decades. I think it's just become more and more visible in the culture as the ruling class, the elites who have been educated at these big schools have gone into the workforce, into HR departments, and begun to shape the culture. So these ideas that began in the ivory towers have now trickled into everyday life. And so people weren't aware of these things if you weren't going to, a elite seminary university. But now you see it at the mall, at, every movie, everything you do, every billboard, every magazine, every song. It's everywhere. Yeah. And I think what you said, true, is that it's not named. One of the big issues that was really frustrating for me for years was trying to get people to stop thinking in terms of labels and start thinking in terms of ideas. Because you can look behind me, I have a whole bookshelf full of books on critical social theory, but many of them don't call it that. They will create their own names: anti-racism, critical pedagogy, whiteness, critical whiteness studies, whiteness pedagogy,
white fragility.
There are all these different, what's that? Yeah, white fragility. But they won't always say, "Hey, we're doing critical theory."
Yeah.
They will just say, "Oh, we're just doing race scholarship. That's all we're doing. We're just talking about honest history." And you'll find they won't say, "Oh, this is we're getting this from the Frankfurt School, we're getting this from Kimberly Crenshaw. It just gets snuck in, and if you don't know what you're looking for, you can totally miss where it's coming from. Another term that's a good one is idea laundering. I think it was coined by Brett Weinstein or Eric Weinstein. Like money laundering, you take dirty money that's been acquired through criminal activity, and you pass it through legitimate enterprises. You pass it through a laundromat or a Chinese restaurant, and it comes out clean. So because you don't know where the money came from, you chalk it up. We just earned it through selling, food. Well, idea laundering is something similar, where you have these crazy ideas coming out of academia, but then they're passed through these layers of citations. So, I'm not citing Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm citing a bunch of Christian authors. If you look at those citations, they're citing a bunch of Christian authors, and those citations they cite. Oh, now you're citing a critical race theorist. Oh, now she's citing the Frankfurt School. Mm-hmm. But the point is, unless you dig through the citations, you have no idea where these ideas are coming from. And there's a whole stack of evangelical books on my shelf where you'll see them clearly espousing the ideas of, say, critical race theory, but they're just citing other evangelical Christians. And unless you dig through the layers of citations, you've realized, they've laundered these ideas through seemingly legitimate sources. But it's really all going back to, say, Kimberly Crenshaw or Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah, and maybe, the way you just phrased it makes it sound like they all know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're doing.
No.
Do you?
No, not at all. It's just shocking. And I'm not saying this pejoratively. There's just there's a level of ignorance about these ideas. And I don't expect the average pastor who's busy visiting people that are sick, I don't expect them to really get why these ideas are better. I don't expect them to know what critical race theory actually is. This is a term that wasn't even popular, unless you were in academia. But 4 years ago, no one knew what critical race theory was. So I want to give them some slack in terms of, I don't expect you to be read up on Foucault and Derrida and all these different theorists and Fanon. But now that it's everywhere in our culture, it's time to put on your big boy pants and learn these ideas and why they're so bad. Because we are beyond the point of just being, stuff is happening out there in the culture. That's crazy. But it's not happening in here in the church. I'm like, yes, it is. It's happening in the church right now. And it's hurting real people that you are supposed to be shepherding.
Let's talk about that a little bit more in depth, because clearly, and I've heard you say this too, racism is real. It's a problem. Sexism, misogyny, it's a problem. I guess you could say homophobia. I don't love the phobia phrase, but that's still a problem in our culture. These things exist. So what's so scary or harmful about critical theory in particular that you think the church today should be aware of?
You alluded to it already. So one thing that critical theorists do is they redefine a lot of words. They redefine familiar words that you think you understand, but they offer surreptitiously, implicitly different definitions, and before you know what you're signing up for. So take homophobia as an example. There are people that actually hate gay people and bully them and abuse them. That happens. People get beat up in school. That's bad. That's wicked, right? We shouldn't hate people for sinning. We should hate ourselves for sinning. Because we're all sinners essentially. But we should. So that's. I think we can reject that actual bigotry and hatred. But they've redefined, say, homophobia to mean in any way thinking that homosexuality is anything but totally good and fine and normal. And if you think that homosexuality is a sin, well, you're homophobic. And I say, wait, that's not phobia. I'm not afraid of people that are gay. I'm just saying it's wrong. It's immoral. Just like I say premarital sex is wrong. Heterosexual premarital sex is also wrong. I'm not premarital sex phobic, but they've redefined the term, or bigotry. It used to mean implacable, immovable, irrational hatred of some group of people. But now it basically means anything that doesn't conform to a progressive standard of morality. Well, they've redefined these terms, and we can throw them out there without realizing it's a bait and switch. Racism is an example. Racism has been redefined. So in the dictionary, it's defined as racial prejudice. But critical race theorists will define racism in many different ways. The most common definition is prejudice plus power, plus institutional power. So they'll use that definition to claim that people of color cannot be racist by definition because they lack institutional power.
Even if they're prejudiced, they're not racist.
They can be prejudiced, but not racist. And I just say right off the bat, you can't redefine words like that. I mean, imagine I said, women can't commit adultery. They can't. They can cheat, but they can't commit adultery. Like, wait, what? Well, I'm using why? Because they don't have power in our society. They're underneath the patriarchy. I'm like, wait a minute. Sin is sin. Mm-hmm. Adultery is a sin, and we sin primarily. We sin against God primarily, and only secondarily against other people. So, regardless of the power structure within society, adultery is a sin for men and women.
Yeah.
But they're playing this language game where they've redefined certain words to make certain people say more complicit, more guilty. And to downplay the degree to which, say, anybody can be racist, anybody can be sexist, anybody can be a bigot. So that happens all the time. They're masters of changing and playing with language. Another great example is how we've redefined the word gender. So gender used to be a synonym for sex back to 1950s, say. But in the 60s, feminists began to redefine gender to refer not to sex, but to refer to the social category that you were put in. So sex referred to your biological sex, meaning XY chromosome, XX chromosomes, your secondary sexual characteristics, things like that. But gender referred to this category that society puts you in, say masculine or feminine. And from there, then queer theorists later then redefine gender to mean basically your internal sense of self, your gender identity now. So it's completely divorced from your actual biology. Now it's how I feel that determines my gender, whereas my sex, maybe it's biological. So another example where you're suddenly using these words, or I hear pastors sometimes will throw out words like white privilege or heteronormativity or oppression. And I'll say, hey, time out. Do you know what you're saying? You might think you know what you're saying, but you're not. These are state-of-the-art terms that mean something to not just to the critical theorists, but to the average person in our culture today. So you got to be really careful not to adopt their language. Or if you do, you can't get away from using words like justice. It's in the Bible. But when you say it today, you have to define what you mean right up front. So I do not mean this, I mean that. Otherwise, we're giving the game away.
Well, I think it's important not just to critique the other side, but to cast a better vision. Let's take justice, for example. Could you give us sort of divergent definitions of a critical theory definition of justice versus a biblical idea of justice?
Sure. So biblically, I think a good definition, I think it goes back to like the Greeks, but it fits the Bible too. Justice means rendering unto each person what is their due, or giving them what they deserve. And of course, that starts with giving God what he deserves, which is our everything, our heart, mind, soul, and strength, loving him supremely. That's justice. We are being unjust towards God if we are refusing to worship him and acknowledge him. But that also applies to other people. So we have a duty to provide for our families. We have a duty to provide for our neighbors, to love our neighbors, to care for them. And then, of course, it extends also into law. So you can talk about unjust laws, like laws like abortion law, right? Laws permitting abortion, laws permitting slavery. Those are unjust laws. And so Christians, part of biblical justice is making sure that our laws as a society are just. So there's some overlap there between what critical theorists might say is a requirement of social justice and what Christians might say is biblical justice. That said, critical theorists do not define justice vertically at all, period, because they're not a theistic ideology. But they also define social justice to mean, this is a quote, the elimination of all forms of social oppression, where that can be based on a person's race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, etc. So what critical theorists believe is that society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, and gender. And that's something called the social binary. There are all these oppressor groups and oppressed groups. There's men oppressing women. There's whites oppressing people of color. There are there are straight people oppressing LGBTQ people. And social justice means destroying the systems and structures which produce the social binary. So they want to level the playing field so that there's no ruling class which imposes its values on culture. This idea that men impose patriarchal values on culture, those values oppress women. whites impose their white supremacist values and norms on culture, and that's white supremacy, and that oppresses people of color. Straight people apply their heterosexist norms and values to culture. That's heterosexism. Well, critical theory works to dismantle all of those hegemonic norms, all of those values that are imposed on culture by the ruling classes to justify their own dominance, to get rid of those things and to create a society in which all groups are treated equally. There's no one dominant narrative that justifies anyone having social prominence. That's their definition.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, something like gender, they would say the gender binary is oppressive because it creates a class of the people that are normal and are doing what the gender binary is normal. Then you have people that are transgender are outside of that binary, that's that normality. So they're labeled as deviant and it's unnatural. It's not. So they would say that's oppressive. The very idea of gender binary is oppressive, or the idea that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. That's an oppressive idea. It's a patriarchal, heterosexist idea that must be dismantled in the name of social justice. So all this, lots there, but that bottom line is that that's two different definitions of justice, and some of the things that they would say are unjust, we would say are actually just. They're God's design for humanity, and so we should actually not dismantle them. We should actually value what God values. So it's a huge disjunction there.
Yeah, I remember hearing when BLM really started making headlines. It was, George Floyd, and we were all at home for COVID and were just watching the news and getting, inflamed in one way or another politically. And I remember hearing critiques of the BLM movement early on that I still hear today, that it's wrapped up in Marxism and that it initially, although they removed this from their website, initially it sought to dismantle the nuclear family. And that really struck a lot of people as odd. From what I'm hearing from you, it would make total sense because all these critical theory movements are sort of in cahoots. They're intertwined in a way. There's an expectation that if you are a proponent of critical race theory, you're also a proponent of queer theory, for example, and dismantling those systems as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and actually that's the notion. What's happened is all of these critical social theories, critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, they've sort of coalesced within an intersectional framework. So the term intersectionality was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race theorist in 1989. And she used that term to describe the way in which, say, a black woman is doubly oppressed. She occupies this unique social location where she's both a woman and she's black, and both of those identities shape her experience of oppression. You can't separate them out. You can't say, well, you're oppressed just because you're black, you're oppressed just because you're a woman. Well, being a black woman makes you uniquely vulnerable to discrimination. But she intended that to be expanded to other categories like your sexuality, your physical ability, your class. All those other categories they can make you triply, quadruply oppressed, or triply, quadruply, multiply privileged. So you have sort of a hierarchy of oppression now. And what that does, though, is because she's arguing that these different oppressions are inextricably linked. You can't just say, oh, you're just oppressed by racism. No, your racial oppression intersects with your gender oppression and your sexual oppression. Because of that, you can't then pull them apart and treat them differently. So this is an incredible quote from a 1993 anthology called Words That Wound. It was co-authored by 4 of the co-founders of critical race theory, Mary Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, Richard Delgado, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And this is 4 years after the movement coalesced. They list 6 defining elements of critical race theory. And number 6 says that they're committed to dismantling racism, sexism, and heterosexism through, quote, massive social transformation. And that critical race theory, its defining element is it's part of a larger liberatory enterprise that seeks to liberate all of these oppressed social groups. So when people say things like, well, we can eat the meat and spit out the bones of critical race theory, I'm like, this is a defining element of CRT, that their co-founders are saying you cannot just take one thing you like from CRT and ignore sexism and heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia. All of these oppressions are experienced simultaneously, and our movement is committed to all of these things, of abolishing all of these systemic oppressions. So again, that's going back to, I have writings in our book. We have tons of primary source quotes, and they go back to like 1989, 1990, the earliest years of the movement. It's from the beginning. It's been about this holistic, comprehensive approach to liberation.
I want to talk about why this should raise alarm bells for us, because whenever it's brought up publicly or on Twitter or somewhere, you always see the pushback that, hey, critical race theory, it's just high-level law school sort of fringed kind of stuff that the average person isn't, it's not imposed on them. It's certainly not imposed on elementary age kids and all of that. And so it's not that dangerous. We're overreacting. We're whatever. And I remember when my daughter was in 8th grade, and she came home, and in the middle of a conversation, she just said, the worst thing to be is a basic white guy. And I thought, that's the weirdest thing for an 8th grader to say. And I just asked her sort of what she meant. And she was like, basic just sort of means plain old, regular, normal white guy. And that's the last thing you want to be. And I just thought, how odd. Like, you would rather be anything else but basic white guy. And it occurred to me that there are social incentives built into a lot of school cultures, let's say, to identify as something on that oppression hierarchy that you described earlier. But what are some of the dangers you see in the real world as this stuff sort of materializes and critical theory surfaces in everyday life?
I mean, the last month or 2 months or so since the October 7th attacks on Israel, we've seen an upsurge of anti-Semitism on college campuses. A good example was that BLM Chicago on October 10th posted a picture of a Palestinian paraglider, and the caption was something like, "We stand with Palestine." Now, remember, the terrorists used paragliders to parachute into Israel and slaughter like 300 people at a music festival. Yeah. And you had BLM Chicago saying that's what we're behind. We're for that. That's anti-oppression because Israel's a colonial power and Palestinians are colonized, they're oppressed. And people were like, this is literal slaughtering innocent civilians through terrorism, and you're for that? And since then, we've seen a number of other these weird signs like Queers for Palestine, or there was an infographic posted by a progressive group called Slow Company that said something like Palestinian justice is climate justice, Palestinian justice is reproductive justice, Palestinian justice is a feminist issue. And you're like, what are you talking about? But I actually saw a poll just a few days ago saying that, I think it was a poll of Harvard students that said that 67% of Harvard students believed that whites were oppressors. And then I think it was 67% that believed that Jews were oppressors, 71% believed that whites were oppressors. And you're like, what? That's as people aged 15 to 24. As you got older demographics reject those ideas. But the younger kids, this is just their bread and butter. They see the world through this lens of oppressor and oppressed. Certain groups are oppressed, certain groups are oppressors. It's not your behavior, it's just the fact that you were born into this certain race or gender or whatever. That's terrible. And we're seeing, funny, it's creating a backlash. I think, seeing a concomitant upswing in actual racism and anti-Semitism on the right. Because in reaction to people being like, all whites are racist, you're trash because you're white, you got the people that are white being like, well, fine, if I'm racist, I'm going to go ahead and just be racist. Yeah. And I keep telling people, I was warning this 4 years ago, I give a talk, how we need to reject both racism and critical race theory. And you can't, as a Christian, make excuses and say, well, they started it, and I'm going to go ahead and just be racist because they call me. You cannot stand before God's judgment seat and say this is like the Adam and Eve stuff. Like, oh, the woman you put in the garden with me, she made me eat the fruit. Not a snake that you created. That's not going to be an answer when God calls you to account for your sin.
Yeah.
So we need to. I understand why people, in reaction to, say, critical race theory, will, as a defense mechanism, embrace racism. But it's still a sin. It's still wicked, and we can't do that. You can't fight sin with sin. You can only fight sin with holiness.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that because I think my primary concern about the conversation we're having now about race, given the rise of critical theory into popular culture, which I think has happened. I think that's undeniable. And we are now defining racism differently. We're defining it structurally. and instead of individually, right? Which I think it should be both to a certain extent. I think you would agree with me with that to a certain extent. What has happened now that we're just defining it structurally, I see two things happening. First, we have taken the honor out of a racist coming to knowledge of his or her racism and repenting of it individually and testifying to that fact, and bringing others into that sort of same realization that I was a racist and I see the error of my ways. That doesn't matter if all racism is structural and institutional. And the other thing I see is it is letting, let me say this a different way. I see this providing cover to real racists.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, and I hesitate to share this because, and I would never tell this person's, name or whatever publicly, but, I'm from Red Lake, Texas, and it's the smallest town you would ever imagine, and especially when I was there growing up. And racism is just real. I didn't go to school with any kids of color until middle school, seventh grade. And you're raised with certain ideas. Anyway, I ran into a guy that I went to school with, and he still lives in Red Lick, and we were texting, and I said something nice to him about something related to his family, and he said to me, he responded, "That's mighty white of you." "That's mighty white of you," he said. And I was just like, dude, really? Like, that was my response. It was like, dude, really? That's mighty white of you. That wasn't the first time I'd ever heard that phrase. It's just something that, racist individuals say to suggest that when you do or say something polite, that's a white thing. Like that,
Yeah, right.
That sort of mentality is real. But when I pushed back against it and I was like, dude, seriously, it's mighty white of you. What are you talking about? And he was like, don't give me that woke BS. So there it was. He was like excusing himself. And I was the bad guy all of a sudden because I sounded woke. And so what I'm trying to say is the rise of critical theory and this language of wokeness in our culture is providing a kind of cover to this insidious racism that exists, I think, in every human heart to a certain degree, but it's making it okay to come out of that closet. I just think it's dangerous in the long run.
Yeah, I've seen that as the backlash against wokeness is that people are like, fine, I'm not going to even bother caring about racism. It's all a Marxist progressive nonsense. I'm like, well, there is a lot of Marxist progressive nonsense out there, but there's also real racism. And I mean, I've had it impact me personally. I'm half Indian. I get told on Twitter to go back to India. I'm like, I'm from Delaware, man. But there are people out there, professing Christians, who are just straight up racist. And again, it's sin. We mortify it. We don't. It's not worse than other sins. Sins are all bad. They're all dishonoring to God, and they're all repellent. We repent of it, though. We acknowledge it, we admit it, and we fight it. And I do, yeah. So I think that's the other side. I think, one, critical race theory, for example, it does empower people who are just anti-white racists. They just hate white people. But it's okay because whites are oppressors. It's like, no. As Christians, we don't allow that. We don't say it's fine to be a racist against whites because you can't really be racist against whites because, no, you can. It's a sin. And then same way, though, we say also you can't be racist against black people or Asians, right? So I think it's a biblical standard. Racism is essentially a sin of partiality. You're partial towards your own group in a sinful way, right? You think you're better than other people because of your whatever skin. There are all kinds of ways you can take pride in your own group over other people. But all of that has to be repented of, and we have to say, no, God desires us to be impartial. And especially within the church, God desires us to treat each other like family. And so I can't walk into church thinking that's an oppressor Christian, that's an oppressor Christian, that's an oppressed Christian. No, in the church, we're a family, the people of God, and we should treat each other that way.
Yeah. I guess the other side of that argument would be, to play devil's advocate a little bit here, is just there are people I trust who would say that's not enough, Neil. We have to have real conversations about individual and structural racism in our culture today if we're going to really honor Christ and really be a family. So I guess I would ask, what is the answer to that problem? If not, critical race theory, and if not, maybe what the traditional answer used to be colorblindness, right? Just don't see color.
Sure.
What do you think is the answer for churches that are trying to do the right thing?
I think this is why critical race theory has such a hold on a lot of people, because evangelicals are sort of ashamed of the sort of tepid evangelical response to the civil rights movement. And it was very mixed. You had there were some Christians who were, pushing for civil rights, and some that were just not, some were even opposed to it. And I think as a response to that, we now are thinking, well, we're gonna atone for our mistakes by embracing critical race theory and showing that we're serious about racism. I think no, because some of these approaches are just wrong and unbiblical. So take systemic racism. We have lots of stuff in our book on this, but the way that most critical race theorists define systemic racism is in terms of outcomes. Ibram X. Kendi is the clearest on this. He says that if you believe that any racial disparity is caused by anything other than discrimination, you're a racist. So let me say it again.
Any racial disparity, yeah, okay.
Disparity, any racial disparity at all. If you think it's due to anything other than purely discrimination, then you're a racist. That's he said flat out in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, and also in his book From the Beginning. So in other words, and then people pressed him on this because it's nonsensical. People are like, Ibram, the NBA is 75% black. It's a disparity. It's way more than random chance that. So is that because of discrimination? And people point there are all kinds of disparities that are not caused by discrimination. It'd be madness to think that. No one's discriminating against white players and hiring black players in the NBA. It's just because black players tend to be better on average.
Yeah.
But he just punts that. He will not actually, in his recent update to the latest edition of the book, he just removes that sentence. So,
really?
But yeah, but if you look, he's not alone. He says it most clearly. But we have in our book, we have numerous quotes from NAACP president, from books, talking about how they tend to equate all racial disparities are the product of systemic racism. That is what it means. But we point out that's just not rational to think that it's all caused by this nebulous, insidious, forces. There are many causes for disparities. Can discrimination, actual discrimination, cause disparities? Of course it can. Yes, absolutely. We cite papers showing that some racial disparities are caused in part by discrimination. There's lots of data on that. That said, it's not all due to discrimination. Some of it is due to all kinds of other factors.
It's a multivariate, in other words.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
So the only point we make is that it's multivariate. Another example would be speeding tickets on the New Jersey Turnpike. Is often used as an example that blacks get pulled over for speeding about twice as often as whites on the New Jersey Turnpike. Well, they studied that example. They said, oh, this is systemic racism. What they found, though, is that that the reason that blacks got more speeding tickets was that blacks tended to speed more. Okay, when they actually measure people's speeds, the blacks were speeding more, and blacks were especially speeding at their extremely high rates. They're disproportionately black drivers speeding. Now, why is that? Are blacks bad drivers? It turns out blacks are younger. These young kids are speeding, and demographically, they're more young drivers who are black. And so, again, it's one of those things where you can't assume. It's just madness to assume that all racial disparities are only due to discrimination. It's multivariate. You have to analyze. And by the way, in our book, we do that. We actually have examples where the sociologists have carefully parsed the variables and have shown real discrimination effects. But it's not as simple as saying disparity equals discrimination. That's not. Actually, Thomas Sowell, who's a black economist, wrote a book entitled Disparities and Discrimination, where he gives all these examples of how disparities are not always caused by discrimination.
Yeah. Well, I think the case could also be made that point, it was just, it's well taken, that point you just made, but it's still not enough to suggest that we shouldn't be doing more to help people of color get a leg up and have equality of opportunity. Are you across the board against things like social programs or affirmative action or anything, programs like these that are meant to help, even out if not the outcome part, the opportunity part, where we're all starting from a similar place as possible?
Right, and that's the key. So we have a section on what equity means. Again, critical theorists have redefined the word equity. Equity used to be a synonym for equality. Now equity means equal outcome. Well, it's a little tricky. They will claim all we want is equal opportunity. They'll say that. If you ask them, though, well, how do you know whether you've achieved equal opportunity? And they will say, when you've achieved equal outcome. So in other words, they'll say, oh, all we want is equal opportunity, but the way they measure that is if you've achieved equal outcomes, then you have equal opportunity, and otherwise you don't. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially it's a bait and switch. They really are pushing for equality of outcome. What I would say is to take affirmative action. I don't think that affirmative action programs as they're currently run, and the Supreme Court agrees with me now, that came out recently, but I think that giving people a boost on race alone is wrong. But I do think there's a very obvious way to call it affirmative action. I wouldn't call it that. I think you can do that. What I would call something called class-based affirmative action. What it means is you take into account people's opportunities when you assess their performance. And it's so obvious. I can't believe we don't talk about this. If you were a basketball recruiter or a football recruiter, right, and one kid, grew up and, as a high-performing football player, but he's a rich parents, he was going to every summer, to a summer camp, had the best trainers, his parents hired tutors for him to be an incredible player. You're like, that's great. And he's performing at this level in terms of just what he can do. But then you have a guy who performs a little bit worse than this other kid, but he grew up in backwater Arkansas, had no support from his family, was working a job because he was poor, did not have tutors, did not have any special opportunities, did not go to camps, and is still competing at this level. If you're a recruiter, don't you think you'd be like, oh, maybe this guy has incredible talent, has been untapped. I'm going to give him a little bump and at least give him a chance because I think with what he has, he's done so much. He's probably got incredible innate talent. Let's get to harness that. That's a great way to think about. So are you going for a quality of outcome? No. What you're saying is if you can get 95s with very few resources, you're probably innately harder working and more talented than the guys getting 96s, but had tremendous resources. So that could be an approach to, say, university admissions where you genuinely take into account people's opportunities in order to assess how they're going to perform in college. What you don't do is you don't just say, well, he's Asian, he's Hispanic, he's black, therefore we're going to do this to his essay. You shouldn't do that. That's partiality. But and ironically, because, say, blacks and Hispanics tend to have lower wealth, lower opportunities, things like that, worse schools in general, on average, than, say, white or Asian students, then if you do this sort of, again, I don't like the term, but class-based affirmative action, where you take into account their resources, it will disproportionately benefit blacks and Hispanics. So you're getting a similar outcome, but it's not based on race, it's based on opportunity. It's a much better way to think about this issue. Yeah. And I really get disappointed that politicians don't talk about that more because I would argue that's a fair way to do admissions, say. And it's going to give you a similar result and yet not be partial. You're really trying to assess, hey, if you do a great job with very little, then I think you're going to do a much better job when we give you resources.
Yeah. It's a harder thing to measure, though, Neil. It seems to me that race could still be a factor in that whole formula because it does tell you something about how their background might have advantaged them or not. I'm not saying we should just do univariate, racially motivated, affirmative action type things, but it's like any of those factors, whether someone had to work a job or not. Well, if you worked a job but you have two parents at home, is that a wash? Do those even out? If you like, how do you do this if not by something as clear as race and ethnicity?
Well, that's exactly why the Supreme Court made the decision it did, is because if you use race by itself as a factor, even as a proxy for opportunity, it's not very good. So a guy who's black, both his parents are doctors, right? They both went to Harvard. It's like, why are we giving him any kind of boost? He has incredible opportunities. I don't think it's fair. And interestingly, in our book, we actually talk about how the idea of equity is actually, it can be okay. So the idea of treating different people differently that sounds horrible. You're treating him differently. Well, no, sometimes it's good. A simple example we use is handicap ramps. We don't say, everybody can use the stairs equally. We're not going to make special arrangements for handicapped people. That's nonsense. You make a handicap ramp. Why? Because they can't use steps. It's not because you're being partial. It's because they physically can't walk up the steps. So treating able-bodied people and disabled people the same, we're going to treat everybody the same, you all walk up the steps, that's silly. But so that's the argument often used for giving, say, people of color affirmative action. But then think about that analogy. Are you really claiming that being black is equivalent to being handicapped? That's actually quite demeaning. So that's why I'm saying there's room for thinking carefully about non-equal treatment in order to overcome a genuine, say, disability. But I think it gets very dicey when you start saying, well, your skin color itself is a disability. We have to give you a boost because of that. I'm sorry, there are plenty of very educated black parents that are professionals. They're doing way better than some poor rural white people in Appalachia. So I don't think we should be using race as a proxy for opportunity. I think it just doesn't work that way. Now, 200 years ago, was that more reasonable? Yeah, 200 years ago. But 2023, things have changed quite a bit. So I think we have to be much more careful about applying I think we tend to be stuck in this mindset of we're like living in Jim Crow South or the antebellum South. We're not, though. We're not anymore. We have to then change how we view things like race.
Interesting. Now, how does the Bible shape your views in regard to these issues and topics we've discussed today? What does the Bible have to say about race and critical theory and the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, in our book, we go through the first half of our book is understanding. Actually, the section title is understanding. So the first 7 chapters are just about understanding these various critical social theories, critical race theory, queer theory, and and the history of those. And then even it closes with a chapter on the positive insights of critical theories. So in that first section, we really wanted to just explain the theories charitably, comprehensively, fairly. We even got some reviewers who were angry. They said at the first half of the book, they were like, this is all terrible. What is this? This is woke stuff. Shenvi's gone woke. Because it was so... I truly believe if you didn't know what we think about these theories, you could read the first half of the book and think, oh, this is promoting them. We're not. We're just explaining them. But we try to be so objective and impartial that it reads like something a critical theorist themselves could write. Then, the second section is... Actually, the hinge is, and it discusses about evangelical theology. What do Christians, Protestants, and then evangelicals, what do we believe about reality? What are some basic Christian principles about who God is, what human beings are, what's our main problem in life, what is sin? We talk about those issues in chapter 8. And then in chapters 9 through 12, we go through critical race theory, queer theory, and just talk about the immense problems. There's more than I could list. Briefly, critical theories function like a worldview. It's a way of viewing reality. It's basically acting like a religion.
Right.
You can't have two religions. You just can't. And we give all the examples of like all the ways in which if you can either choose to prioritize the values and the ideas and the emotional investment of critical theory or Christianity. You can't do both. And to the extent you try to, you're going to either reject Christianity or reject critical theory. So that's just one broad objection, is that these are just mutually incompatible. It's like saying I'm going to be an atheist and also a Christian. No, that you can't. They're fundamentally incompatible. I'm going to be a naturalist and also a Christian. Like, well, you can't be a naturalist Christian because Christianity teaches that the supernatural exists. You just can't be those things. So that's one broad. Number two is that our identities. Critical theory thinks that we need to view ourselves primarily in terms of whether I'm oppressed or oppressor. My whiteness, my masculinity, my femininity, my sexuality, all of those things define who I am primarily. I'm primarily a member of certain groups locked in a battle for dominance. Whereas Christianity says, no, primarily you're a child of God. Your relationship to God is the first thing about you that matters. And then I view everybody else around me in terms of, are they part of God's kingdom or are they not? So the vertical dimension of our identities is primary, and everything else is secondary. Well, again, that conflicts with the way that critical theory teaches us to think about our identities. In terms of how we know the truth, critical theory prioritizes lived experience. Your lived experience is what helps you determine what is true about reality. Your experience of oppression, racism, sexism, classism, those things give you authority to speak about your sexuality, or it gives you insight into justice that white men don't have. But we would say no. The ultimate authority and standard is the Bible and God's revelation in nature. We have to test our own lived experience against the Bible and against the objective evidence out there in reality. We can't just rely on our feelings to determine truth. So there are all of these. Again, we have like 4 chapters on this. But in so many ways, critical theory is just totally incompatible with Christianity. And I mean, something that's obvious, like queer theory, just denies any kind of gender binary, denies any kind of biblical sexual ethics. But it's not just queer theory, it's critical race theory, critical pedagogy. All of them, taken as a whole, are just not compatible with Christianity.
Yeah. That's interesting. I have to check myself sometimes, and I know you probably do too, just because we all are prone to follow our incentives and the most, the path of least resistance, I suppose. And for a able-bodied, tall, middle-class, middle-aged, white, straight guy like me, it is the path of least resistance is the eradication of these ideas of critical theory. Like it is to reject or at least ignore these theories. And so I have to check myself sometimes and realize it can't be that simple. I need to wrestle with these ideas and maybe even see something in them that makes me uncomfortable and learn from that, right? And in terms of the Bible, man, it's, I know you're aware, but there are plenty of passages, and not just cherry-picking verses here and there, but like whole swaths of Scripture that would seem to at least align with the heart of some of what I hear from the critical theory community, right? The anti-racism community, and these power dynamics. Like some of that is biblical. Like I can't get around the fact that, Mary's song, for example, we're about to be, talking about Mary. We're recording this around Christmas. And so, bring down the haughty, bring down the high and mighty, lift up the lowly. Like that sounds similar in some ways, at least.
It's Marxist. She's a Marxist.
Yeah, right. I know she isn't and wasn't.
Yeah.
And yet, the heart of it is we have to pay attention to that. There's something about the heart of God that does seek to humble the arrogant and powerful and lift up the lowly and powerless. How do you reconcile that biblical truth with these sort of political ideas?
One thing that's important is to recognize that the Bible does see our primary problem as our alienation from God. And so in the Bible, the humble are not just poor, right? You can be poor and wicked in the Bible, and there are examples of that. And but the poor, the reason that the poor were, well, one, they're vulnerable, and so God does care for even poor people that are not necessarily righteous, but He cares for them because they're hurting. That God cares for the lowly and the humble. But in the Bible, generally speaking, the reason that the poor are beyond the fact that they're just vulnerable, the reason that the poor are seen as somewhat praiseworthy, but it's because they realize their need. That's and on the context of the haughty, it's not that they're just rich. I mean, there were rich people in the Bible like Abraham and David and Solomon. There were rich people that followed God, that God loved. But the danger in the Bible, especially we see this in Jesus' teaching, is that if you're rich, you feel like you don't need God. Whereas if you're poor, you realize your need for God. That's the real dividing line. It's not that God just despises rich people and loves poor people. It's that people that are in poverty, and then Paul talks about this, people that they're weak, that are despised, that are the outsider, they realize their need for something more. Whereas people that are rich and competent and successful, they got their life figured out. So that's really the actual dividing line in the Bible is between, essentially, it's not rich and poor, it's actually the proud and the humble. And there's an overlap, and there's a reason there's an overlap. The reason there's an overlap is because if you are poor, you realize very fast, I can't make it on my own. If you're rich, it's very hard for you to say, oh, I need help. No, I don't need help. I'm rich. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and you can too. That pride is what keeps you from God and God's grace. Yeah. So I think that's the big difference between, say, people have called Marxism a Christian heresy, because it just maps those biblical categories of, say, proud and humble onto economic categories, and then tries to solve the problem, not in terms of like, well, then trust in Jesus to rescue you, but in terms of, let's just fix the economy, and we'll uplift the oppressed and the poor, and we'll fix society. But it is, in a sense, it's just a perversion of Christianity, which has a vision of the future and of the kingdom and of liberation. So I don't want to discount the fact that we are called to care for the physically poor and the physically downtrodden. But I do think Christians have to see our fundamental problem as a spiritual one. And Jesus himself said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? So, no one gets a free pass for their sin because they're poor or rich.
Yeah.
Our sin is there and needs to be atoned for, and then through Jesus, that's how it's accomplished. It's not through, I'll just give enough money away and then I'll be right with God. No, Jesus had to come and die for that.
Wow. It made me think of what you just said. Made me think of a Chesterton quote about virtues and vices in the post-Christian world. It's like, I'm going to butcher this, but he said something like, in the post-religious, post-Christian age, our biggest fear shouldn't be vices gone awry, or vices being unleashed on the world, but virtues becoming untethered from the source of virtue. And some of what you're saying about Marxism and critical theory seem like virtues that have just become untethered from the capital S source of the virtues, and it can be very difficult for the average person to discern one from the other. And I think that's what makes this such a serious, important topic. One last thing about power dynamics. We talked a lot about power from rich and poor, and in terms of racial and gender relationships and things like that. What is the Bible's answer to power? I mean, it seems like critical theory's answer to power is power must be dismantled. All power structures are inherently evil and must be torn down. What does the Bible say about power?
It's interesting because that is an interesting contrast in terms of critical theory. Basically, can only envision fixing power by reversing it. It's like the problem is they're powerful people. We got to either get rid of power totally, or swap the powerful and the powerless. Like give the powerless power. Christianity has a totally different answer, which is not to get rid of power and authority, but to use power and authority to serve. And it's so radically different because, and ironically, I think we can fall into saying that this modern trap of thinking power is bad. Let's get rid of power. And Jesus never did that. Jesus never said, no one's going to be great among you. He said the one who will be great among you is the one who serves, right? The one who wants to be a leader become the servant and slave of all. Yeah. And Jesus, and think about it, Jesus had power. He has power and authority, all authority. But he uses it to serve his people, to love his church. In the same way, we're supposed to take our power, genuine power and authority, but we're supposed to use it to bless those who are under our power and authority. The best example of this, although it's unfortunately even we're destroying this as a culture, but parents and kids. Before I had kids, I was kind of like, I want to be one of those cool parents who's not cool, but just, I'm not going to lord it over my kids and give them orders, make them obey. I'm just going to talk to them and reason with them and convince them that what I do is right. But I quickly realized, one, that's not going to work. Number two, it's good for them to submit to my authority. I mean, I am a sinner. I'm not always giving them right commands. But generally speaking, 95% of my commands are for their good. I'm like, kid, if you obeyed me, you'd be 3 times happier every day, 10 times happier if you just obeyed. Why? Because I'm not doing this for my good. I'm doing it for your good. So being a parent has really taught me that power wielded properly is a blessing. And think about it. God has all the power. Isn't it God's power a blessing to you? Isn't God's law, his commands, aren't they ultimately for your good? I mean, Spurgeon said, the heart of the law is do thyself no harm. To obey God's law is to bless yourself, and to disobey God's law is to curse yourself. That's understanding of power is so counterintuitive. And again, critical theory doesn't understand it. Critical theory is just either get rid of power or invert it.
Yeah.
The idea of actually taking power and using it to bless others is just radical. But Jesus exemplified that.
I think that's so key to this conversation, especially for Christian listeners right now. You've talked about your book. Just tell us again who you wrote the book for. And give us all the information we need about where to find it and how to buy it.
Sure. So Critical Dilemma, we wrote it basically for everyone. We have like 25 endorsers. 4 of those endorsers were atheists. Peter Boghossian, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Eric Kaufman, or they're secular authors. We had tons of evangelicals endorsing it. J.D. Greer, Carl Truman wrote the foreword. Danny Aiken. We had Presbyterians, Anglicans, John Stone Street. So we had really broad endorsements. You can pick it up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, ChristianBook.com, anywhere you can buy books. But I will say, one thing I'm most proud of our book is that we cite primary sources extensively. We have over 770 footnotes. We have 440 plus Bible references. So it's biblically grounded. It's scholarly. It's accessible. You don't have to be a PhD to read it. It's meant for average people to read, but we want to not create a straw man. You're going to read block quotes from critical theorists themselves. We explain them. We have diagrams and pictures, but we want to give Christians a fair and accurate understanding of these ideas first, and then to critique them accurately. So I feel really proud that we did our due diligence in terms of really letting you see what they actually believe, and only later holding it up to the scrutiny of the Bible. And we also, another thing I'd say too, is that we are really careful in terms of like not swinging the pendulum to the other side and ignoring racism. We have a whole chapter on our U.S.'s racial history, slavery and Jim Crow, present day racial discrimination that still exists. We cite sociological papers, studies, surveys, and so we really try to do a fair, balanced job, and I think it is for everybody. I think this is an unavoidable issue. If you ignore it, it's gonna come back to bite you. So you got to get our book, please, and invest in this.
I agree. I think I really appreciate your balanced approach in the book, and in your, as I said earlier, your Twitter feed is always entertaining and again balanced. If you're on Twitter, you're listening right now, be sure to follow @Neil Shenvi, and pick up Critical Dilemma on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. Neil, I know you've not been feeling well. I know you came down with a cold overnight, so really grateful for you making the time, and we've kept you longer than we had planned to. So I'm really especially grateful for you spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Neil.